Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
How you doing, Ant?
I'm doing well, James.
I thought maybe if I started that way, you wouldn't say something stupid right off the top.
I was about to say how chipper you are this week, but no.
Yeah. Sorry. You know, they say that when you drown, you become euphoric at that last moment.
Right.
I don't know how they know this, but nonetheless, when I ask you a question, I feel a little euphoric right there at the end. Then you start answering it, and well, what can you do? But with that as prologue, what's new in your world this week, Ant?
Last week, we talked about how the federal government spent over $800 billion building a website so people could compare health insurance prices, and how the website didn't work. And then, how someone came along and for a few $1,000s built one that did. Related to that, listener David Doyle from Ireland wrote us to say that in 1999, a web development company quoted the Irish budget airline Ryanair 4.5 million euros to build Ryanair's first website.
It's a lot of cabbage.
It was, and as it turns out, the CEO at the time, and remember this is back in 1999, thought the internet was going to be a flash in the pan, didn't want to hear anything about it, and certainly wasn't interested in spending 4.5 million euros, which it turns out was a smart idea because teenager John Beckett ended up building it for $20,000.
Yeah, that sounds right. And that was probably quite a lot for Mr. Beckett.
It was
probably.
Well, it was. And I saw a video with him. We'll put the link in the show notes. And he says that he would have done it for free. He just thought it was a neat idea.
That's just perfect. And I should mention that David Doyle writes us world-class email.
He does. His excellent emails. I always enjoy hearing from David.
It's always smart, it's always on the point, and it's always way better than all the other emails we get every week.
What's interesting here is I'm thinking about this case with Ryanair. Ryanair, of course, is a profit-driven entity. It's the profit motive that caused that company to seek out and choose the 20,000 euro teenager instead of the 4.5 million euro web dev company. But the government isn't a profit-driven entity. And people usually say that as if it's a good thing. Well, the government's not in it for profit. Yeah, it's a power-driven entity. And so it has an incentive to do the opposite, to spend $800 billion building the website because spending that much accrues lots of power to the various decision makers up the chain. Raj Sukram owns 13 rental properties in Rochester, New York. One of his tenants stopped paying rent in December 2020, so almost a year ago. Another stopped paying rent a year before that, December 2019. A third tenant stopped paying this past spring, then demanded that Mr. Sukram fix her hot water heater.
This is why you don't go into business in New York.
Yeah, it gets worse. He didn't, right? Which, of course, is reasonable. If the person's not paying rent, they should be kicked out.
He's going to be cited immediately.
Exactly. City officials threatened him with daily fines. In total, Mr. Sukram says that half of his tenants are behind on rent. And all of this is happening because the federal government has imposed a moratorium on evictions, which prohibits landlords from throwing out tenants who are behind on their rents. And tenants do the reasonable thing. They stop paying. Why? Because they can. Now, let me be more specific here, because I said the federal government imposed the moratorium. That's not correct. Specifically, the Centers for Disease Control issued the moratorium. And if that sounds strange to you, it should. The CDC has no authority to do this.
This is as ridiculous as when the CDC declared gun violence something that should be regulated in the name of public health.
Granted, but there's a big difference between saying it should be regulated and actually regulating it, which is what they're doing
Right.
here. The CDC has said to landlords, you may not throw out your renters. They have no authority to do this, and we know this because the Supreme Court of the United States said they have no authority to do this. In June, the court said that the CDC has exceeded its statutory authority and was obliged to stop issuing these moratoriums. The CDC, and by extension President Biden, to whom the CDC ultimately reports, ignored the Supreme Court. Let me say that again. The CDC, an organization of non-elected bureaucrats that has no legislative authority whatsoever, ordered landlords not to evict tenants. And when the Supreme Court told them to cut it out, They and the President of the United States ignored it. And what has happened? Mr. Sukram and landlords like him are struggling to pay their bills and taxes because while the CDC has said that their tenants don't have to pay rent, it has not extended any such consideration to the landlords whose expenses continue to pile up. Now, you and I have repeatedly said two things for which our detractors have repeatedly said that we are crazy people. First, we claim that Congress has handed over so much of its power to unelected bureaucracies that we are in danger of being ruled by dictatorial fiat if the Supreme Court ever attempted to rein in those bureaucracies and the president ignored the court. Well, guess what just happened?
Guess what time it is, everybody? Time for the crazy people to actually take a victory lap.
Right. Second, we warn that saying that housing is a right means that you're okay with the government forcing people to supply housing.
That is correct.
In declaring the moratorium, the CDC has said that tenants have a right to housing, at least under certain conditions. And what's happening? The city of Rochester is threatening Mr. Sukram with fines, and if he doesn't pay them, jail comes next, if he doesn't fix the hot water heater of a tenant who doesn't pay rent.
Not to put too fine a point on this, but you're out of your mind if you want to do business in New York.
Yeah.
You're out of your mind.
Yeah.
These are people who do not care about the rules of the game. They just make them up as they go along, and that's where you're going to be if you strive to do business in New York. Add in Southern California, if you'd like, well, maybe most of California, actually, and any number of other places, looking at you, Massachusetts, Connecticut, et cetera, et cetera. As long as this is how people go about their business, you can bet that we're going to have housing shortages. Why? Because it doesn't make any sense to be in that business. I've got something that's not quite in the ridiculous file that yours belongs in, but I want to talk about jobs numbers because I've been looking at things a little bit in the last couple of days, and it seems right now, according to a CNBC article, there are 6.1 million fewer Americans working now than in February of 2020. 6.1 million. And that would be right before the virus of indeterminate origin hit us. There's something more interesting when you crawl into this data a little more. There are about 1 million more job openings right now than there are people applying for jobs.
Yes.
Employers can't bribe people well enough to take a job. And I use the term bribe here very specifically because there are all kinds of new benefits that are emerging, right? Some employers are offering pet insurance. Pet insurance, come on, people.
Well, I know because my son was looking at it. Target is offering to pay tuition for its employees.
And we've got a fair amount of that going on around here. In Arizona, the minimum wage is over $12 an hour. And still, people aren't taking the jobs because the government, in the form of unemployment insurance, has taught people that it's actually more lucrative not to work.
Yep.
And then when you don't work, you've got lots and lots of free time, which is actually quite lovely. And people seem to have learned that they shouldn't work and that they should have more free time and they should get more money for not working. When you're looking at millions of people, I think you have to declare it a trend. This is not an oddity. This is the new reality. When this all comes back to heel, I don't know. But the American people seem to be operating on the assumption that they don't really have to work if they don't feel like it. And that will end badly sooner or later. I'm not saying it's going to end badly tomorrow, but it's going to end badly. So that, of course, brings us to the foolishness of the week. I thought about declaring the foolishness of the week with a breathless AP article about whether we should still shake hands or not, but that was just a little too foolish. Instead, Anthony, we go to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Did you remember reading a story about...
No, what's going on there?
Apparently, there is a gigantic boulder.
It's the rock!
On the campus.
Yes!
It is the rock. It's a gigantic boulder. Apparently, in the 1920s, 100 years ago, some people referred to that rock with a racial epithet. 100 years ago. I need to emphasize that this was 100 years ago.
And they didn't put it there in an act of racism. They just referred to it using a racial epithet.
That's right. The rock was already there, given how big and heavy it was. What they did back when was uncover it from the earth around it so people could see just how big the rock was. And yet, somehow or another, a bunch of people 100 years. Did I mention that it was 100 years later? A bunch of people from 100 years later declared that the very existence of the rock in their midst was such a debilitating example of prejudice against them that they just couldn't even. 100 years.
And so I saw a picture. They've got huge equipment in there moving the thing. I don't know what they're going to do with it.
Oh, they've got a place already picked out for it. They're going to, drag it to some new location where people who have weak constitutions won't be made to look at it
Did
anymore.
it not occur to anyone that they could just rename the rock something else?
No, that didn't occur to anyone. The issue is that some people in 1920 referred to it by a racial slur. It took me a long time to find out what the slur was because they just kept saying a racial slur. And I kept thinking, what the hell could they have called a rock that's so bad? But I had this masterstroke. When I couldn't find out what the word was, I thought to myself, search Fox News.
Right.
They'll
tell you.
And don't you know it, Fox News had published it, no problem. But we're at a place now, Anthony, I've said this 1,000 times in the last week and a half. When everything is racist, nothing is. And if you're declaring a gigantic boulder to be racist, trust me, we have crossed the Rubicon on
But this is happening on a college campus. College administrators are noteworthy in the best of times for bending over backward to whatever the latest thing is that comes along.
Oh, can we call them idiotic whims?
Yeah.
I'm going to call them idiotic whims. I don't work at a university anymore. I can actually say these things. You might want to shut your mouth, but I can say these things. So yeah, there it is. A gigantic rock is now officially racist, and I'm wondering when we will turn our attention to America's various pieces of farmland. Maybe they're somehow racist too, and we can have no more farmers.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. Last week, we spent the episode talking about things that people say about the economy that are just false. This week, we want to turn our attention to things that people say about politics that are just false. And the theme here is these are things that people keep repeating over and over to the extent that a lot of people just take it for granted that these things are true without ever questioning.
There are all sorts of things that fit this category, and I'm sure you will pull some out of the file that you keep on these matters. But before we do that, let's go to something that one of our listeners sent in. And this is from Ed Charnock, who writes, I was in Political Science 101, that's the basic course for those who might not know, in fall of 1974. That's a really long time ago. Ed must be old.
I was in 4th grade.
Just saying, I would have been 7 years old. Ed says, the professor asked, how many of you know who any of your federal senators or representatives are? And about half the class raised their hands. He then asked, how many of you can name any committee they sit on or how they voted on any bill in the last session? And about 10% of the class raised their hands.
That's 10% more than I would have guessed.
But wait, there's more. Next, he asked how many of you are going to vote in November, and everybody raised their hands. So, yeah. Par for the course, right? Nobody knows what the hell they're talking about, but they can't wait to go and vote. He said that is why you have the government you have and the government you deserve. Most of you served in NOM or now know someone who did. We all lived through Watergate, yet only half of you even know who is in D.C., and 90% of you have no idea what they're doing. This is political science, not English lit. You should be the most politically involved generation in decades, but you are a bunch of idiots. Hats off to this unknown professor for saying it.
Yeah.
Right? Because this is the kind of thing that if you said now, you'd have to go have a meeting with the dean because you called your students idiots, and that gets in the way of their enjoyment of their 4 years of their Club Med education.
But notice something here. This is one of the things that people say who are all for government regulation of markets. They say, well, we have control over the government, and if we don't like what they're doing, we vote them out, so we get the kind of regulations we want. And what do you have here? A bunch of people having no idea not only what they're doing, but who even is serving.
And these are college students in a political science class.
Yeah.
They might be considering this independently of their classroom session, you would think. And Ed sends this because I often say, sooner or later, people get the government they deserve. And he pointed out, I think fairly so, that I'm hardly the first person to say this, and then he wanted to point us to his professor from his college days, which I think is perfectly reasonable. And everything this professor said is a variation on you get the government you deserve. I'm sure we're going to get back to what you just said in another context in a minute or two. But this is the week that I get to talk and you be quiet, which is the thing that I wait all year for.
No, I get to throw out the questions. In thinking about things that people say or advocate, one of the big things is term limits. People say often, particularly when they get annoyed at what's going on in Washington, that the answer to our problems is term limits. The president is term limited, and so too should be the House of Representatives and the Senate.
It's interesting that you start with the president. That's where I would have started too. The president is, in fact, term limited. Everybody knows this. Generally speaking, you get 2 4-year terms. Now it gets a little more involved if you served as president, having been vice president.
This is only since FDR.
That's correct. So the original regime was not designed this way. Alexander Hamilton wrote about exactly this point back in 1787 in Federalist 72. And he asks a rhetorical question roughly in the middle of the number. He says, would it promote the peace of the community or the stability of the government to have half a dozen men who had credit enough to be raised to the seat of the supreme magistracy, wandering around the people like discontented ghosts and sighing for a place which they were destined never more to possess? That's actually a good point, isn't it? And we see this occasionally with ex-presidents. George W. Bush has proven to be a very good ex-president. He doesn't weigh in on current events. And I think you could say the exact same thing about Barack Obama. Very good ex-president. Doesn't make a nuisance of himself when it comes to looking at what's happening in the country right now. And it goes back pretty well. I think almost all of our ex-presidents fit this mold. Jimmy Carter, on the other hand, a vociferous critic of lots of things, always offering his little bit in the public space. Granted, it's grown silent over the years. But he was a terrible ex-president for a very long time. If Hamilton says you term limit people out, you will get this eventuality. And that's right, because what's a term limit? It's telling somebody who the voters like, you can't run anymore. It's not telling bad candidates they can't run anymore. It's telling very good ones they can't run anymore. That's a little strange. So Hamilton in the Federalist wrote, of course, Madison would have agreed or it wouldn't have gotten published, but this is something that allows us to peer inside Hamilton's brain. What ends up happening is he makes a very common sense argument. If you want term limits, you already have them. It's called the vote.
Right.
You can vote anybody out of office that you want. And of course, this doesn't foresee the eventualities that have come in between then and now, where somebody sitting in the office has all kinds of benefits that his opponents never have.
I think that's what people are going after. You said, understandably, that it's the good ones who'll be term limited. That is, you only run up against a term limit if you're someone who is going to win the election. But I think you're hitting the nail on the head. What people are getting at here is this idea that somehow the incumbent has some benefit, some head start in the race that gives him the election unfairly.
Yeah, and I'm sure Donald Trump would agree with that. Oh, wait a minute. No, he wouldn't. No, he would not. This is with an eye towards the presidency. So what did we do? We had a constitutional amendment, got it signed all the way through, and now the answer is 2 terms. Good enough for George Washington, probably good enough for you too. But what happened here was the result of a constitutional amendment which required overwhelming support to pass. Now take a step back from thinking about it in those terms and ask yourself, well, what about congressmen and senators and this sort of thing? They are untouched by this. And there was a time, not too terribly long ago, early 90s, that this bubbled up and caused all kinds of problems. And I don't know what the issue is here, but people who are alive and jabbering on about politics right now don't do their homework. They just say, well, we should have term limits, and they leave it at that as if they've said something monumentally intelligent. But they're not, actually. They're saying something monumentally stupid, because the Supreme Court ruled on this in 1992. And the Supreme Court opined that no state can add qualifications to the list of qualifications that appears in the Constitution when you're thinking about running for the House or the Senate. The list in the Constitution is the only list there can be. So you've got to be of a certain age, you have to have a certain residency. How many terms you've served already does not appear in the Constitution. Therefore, it's not a thing to be dealt with. There is no constitutional way to deal with this. And for those of you who doubt what I say, take a look at U.S. term limits versus Thornton, which was decided finally in 1995 on exactly the grounds I just said.
Now, when you say there's no way to deal with it, that is within the current Constitution, we would have to have an amendment if we wanted term limits.
That's absolutely correct. You can have it as long as enough of your fellow citizens agree, as they did with the presidential requirements, to change the Constitution. And I think what really causes some problems here is that in a number of states in the country, state representatives are term limited.
Right.
They see this happening right underneath their nose where they live, and they just assume the same rule could apply to the federal legislature. It can't. Every time somebody starts talking about this, I say, this is unconstitutional for these reasons. You can't have it. And they just keep right on talking about it as if I have four heads.
I was for a long time an advocate of congressional term limits, understanding that it would require an amendment, until somebody pointed out to me that if indeed we did have term limits on senators and representatives, what would very quickly happen is that the power would come to rest with the bureaucracy, with the unelected people, because they're the only ones that would have institutional memory, who would know how to work the system because they've been there long enough. And that was enough to turn me and say, yeah, that's absolutely right. Term limits are a bad idea.
Yeah, and you can think about this in terms of just simple continuity. If we have somebody who's the chairman of, pick your important subcommittee, the budget subcommittee, it might make a lot of sense that that guy stays in that position for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
And you see this even when the Congress tips to the other party. You see the old guys who have been chairman for 20 or 30 years staying on the exact same committee. So the chairman from the other party can look at him and say, what do you think about that? And that's an important thing to keep around. That living memory issue is really important. And anybody who's worked at intellectual type jobs should know you go to work and you're not going to always find somebody who's been around more than a year. And the institutional memory is just gone. And you say, well, we should do X. And if there were better institutional memories, you'd know that 3 other people had tried to do X over the last 25 years and failed.
It failed, and why they failed. Yeah.
That's right. And it's just the same kind of thing that happens. Now, I don't care for lifelong representatives. I think that these people are completely out of touch with regular people and how they have to live. Nonetheless, I don't think term limiting them out is the right answer. I think voting them out is the right answer. If you think your representative is not representing you effectively, vote for the guy on the other ticket.
And this goes back to the quote that you read earlier. If you, the voters, are not going to end up voting this guy out, this is on you for not paying attention, not being involved.
That's exactly right. You can't whine about it and not be on the hook for most of it.
All right, so let's shift gears for a minute. Something that people often say to me, kind of in a way to shut down discussion, is whatever it is that we're discussing, something is right because the majority voted for it.
What a bunch of...
Yeah, as if democracy has some magical power.
That is pernicious nonsense right there. I'll point out that Adolf Hitler came to power legally. Just because a majority voted for him doesn't mean that everything he did afterwards was even close to the right thing. Our system is actually set up to limit how much popular interference there can be in the grinding wheels of government. And remember, the founders were clearly of a mind that government was really, really dangerous. That's why you have to limit the amount of power it wields. What's more dangerous? The people themselves, who are kept at arm's length when we think about the government that was originally designed in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. There's no great love for democracy, and there's also no great love for the power of government. Both of these things are supreme difficulties that have to be dealt with. I'm returning now to Madison's a paraphrase of him. You have to have a government that is powerful enough in the objects it addresses to do a good job, and not powerful at all any other way. So there's a few things that government does, and those things are really important, and we'd better fix it so it can do those things. Every other thing should be eliminated from its field of vision. Mm-hmm. I would submit that that first thing we've done pretty well. That second thing we've done not at all. And what happens now? The Republican form remains underneath everything we've built on top of it. So, okay. But the Democratic element, a small d Democrat, right? The Democratic element of the United States government has grown and grown and grown and grown. All of a sudden, however we would refer to the people, They have a voice in almost everything. And in the things they have no voice in, they think they're morally allowed to speak there too. That's just not right. There's all kinds of things that we would never put before a vote. And I'm thinking here especially of the Bill of Rights. Think about this for a second. We get free speech and religion and the press all in the First Amendment. Do we have to vote on that? Can we just have a vote and ask if the press should be free? Because the First Amendment exists to keep it from ever being voted on.
Right. It's not supposed to be subject to a vote.
This is the answer forever and for all time. Alexander Hamilton, in Federalist 84, I believe it was, said that we should not have a Bill of Rights because it will confound people. It will come to be the case that people will think that only the rights that are mentioned in the Bill of Rights are the rights they have. Why would you want to put them in a list?
Yeah.
What the hell's wrong with you? And I thought about Hamilton making this point when I was a younger man, and I thought, no, Alexander Hamilton, that's not smart. And the older I got, the smarter I realized it is.
I was having a discussion with someone on Facebook just the other day, and exactly this topic came up. I forget what it was we were discussing, but I said something about people doing something, X, Y, or Z. And the guy came back with, show me where in the Constitution people have a right to do that. I said, time out. That's not what the Constitution's about.
Have a quick look at the 10th Amendment. It reserves every single thing not mentioned in the Constitution to the states or the people respectively. Every single thing not mentioned. You could make a very firm argument that 80% of the federal government is perfectly unconstitutional. We've just played fast and loose with the Constitution for so long that this is the answer you get. And when this is the answer you get, a bunch of people who aren't smart enough to go do some reading think that this is absolutely the way we should be doing things.
And to underline that we're not crazy people, that's not saying that these things shouldn't be done. It's simply saying that if they are to be done, they should be done at the state level.
When you look at the states, now we've got the doctrine of incorporation, where the Supreme Court says, well, we know that the Bill of Rights was written to control Congress. That's why it starts with Congress shall make no law. And we realize that it wasn't always applicable to anything other than Congress. But we've come so far, and we've got the 14th Amendment now. And the 14th Amendment requires that we incorporate the Bill of Rights through it selectively to the states to get the answers we want. That is literally the argument that has been used. That's the argument.
Okay, so there's a whole episode here that I'd like to pursue at some point.
An episode, and we could do this every week for a year and a half. This is how things happen now. We just take it as a given that the Bill of Rights matters to the states and to the towns, to anything. This is why we have these arguments every Christmas when some lunatic puts up a manger and says, there, look at my manger. And everybody else says, First Amendment, Well, the First Amendment doesn't apply to the town green wherever you live until, of course, the Supreme Court says that it does for whatever goofy reason it's got. And the goofy reason is incorporation through the 14th Amendment. Congratulations. Now everything is literally a federal issue.
Well, it's interesting because I always wondered why it is that we pay so much attention to the federal Constitution and very little attention to state constitutions.
You can't. In the Federalist, you get this argument. They said that the federal Constitution, I think this might have even been John Marshall early on in the court, that the federal Constitution has to be small. It can't include everything, lest it come to be as confusing as, what was the phrase? The prolixity of a law code. And if you think about all the state laws, well, that's what the Constitution could have been. Mm-hmm. But nobody would have ever read it. And when I was in California, the regular citizens can get a constitutional amendment on the ballot every year. So they're all standing outside at the Walmart getting people to sign their idiotic things. And it was so bad that in one of the years I was there, these were about insurance. I don't remember the exact nature of it, but there were 2 constitutional amendments that were passed. One, that X never happen anymore. The other, that X always happens.
And they both got passed?
They both got passed by pretty safe margins.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, which means that a number of people had to have voted for both. And there you go. But when you look at the Constitution, it wasn't designed to include everything. It was designed to include everything the federal government had to worry about, which for the framers was a very short list. Things like a common defense, interstate and international trade.
So you took us down this path talking about The way I phrase it is the founders were afraid of democracy, and they built a buffer between the people and the federal government. And over time, we've done away with portions of that, the direct election of senators. Senators used to be elected by what, the state legislatures?
State legislatures, that's right.
And now, well, I guess in effect, we've kind of gotten rid of the Electoral College, and people are calling for it to absolutely be gotten rid of.
We did an episode on that, so I don't want to get too far into the weeds on it here. But people are crabby about the Electoral College, and they tend to be crabby about it a month and a half after the most recent election. Right. Everybody's hot and bothered, and they're all throwing their arms up in the air saying, this is untenable, it's undemocratic, we can't have this. 6 weeks later,
It is undemocratic. That's the point.
It is, and thank God, and it would have been way better if we kept going down the road we were going on. But by the time people get to Thanksgiving and Christmas, they're thinking more of turkey dinners than they are of the Electoral College. So that's probably for the best. And we can get in on that again down the road, but we did a pretty comprehensive episode on it, as I recall.
Yeah, right around the last election.
Go figure.
Right.
The direct election of senators is a more problematic thing to consider, because under the original Constitution, I'm talking about before anything got monkeyed with in the form of amendments, all you had at the level of an individual voting into this system, the individuals voted for the House of Representatives, and that's all.
Mm-hmm.
The Electoral College took care of the presidency. Now, you could vote for electors, but you don't vote directly for the president. And the Senate was a result of state legislative action. So really, the only thing that you had that you could say, this is my right as a citizen of the United States, was that direct vote of the House of Representatives. And the House was designed, I mean, you've heard this phrase, to be the people's house. So it was expected that it would serve this purpose. And what does that mean relative to the Senate? It means that whatever gets the people all hot and bothered right now, that they want something right now, that's for the House of Representatives. Because in 2 years, the entire House is up for re-election. And if they don't look like they've done the people's bidding, they will be voted out. The Senate, on the other hand, has a different animating principle. The Senate is there for that continuity that we talked about earlier. The Senate puts the brakes on asinine legislation when it emerges from the House. So if the House of Representatives tomorrow outlawed 3 pronouns, just to stick with something in the popular mind, the Senate would say, yeah, that's great what you did there, but no, we're not doing that. And only 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election. So if the people got it in their heads to punish the senators, 2/3 still remain out there. There's very little you could do about it.
Right, 1/3 at a time, and even then every 6 years.
Yeah, and 6 years, we have come to find out, is generally far too long for any issue to survive. The American people don't have a 6-year attention span. When we switched over to the direct election of senators, constitutionally amended, all correct. What ends up happening, though, is the role that senators played prior to the early part of the 20th century was to represent state interests, which is exactly why the state legislatures had such a say in who got there. Now, what's their role? To appease the electorate. They're directly elected now. The difference between them and the House, while still considerable enough, is not absolute. You're going to get a lot of pandering from senators now. And if you think about it, the only senators you know are the ones you see pandering. All of this, I think, flies in the face of the idea that the framers had, that democracy needs to be kind of beaten down a bit. They were never of a mind that nothing should be democratic. They were absolutely of a mind that almost everything should be Republican. In that, I think I agree with them fully. I vacillate on this a little bit year over year, but I think that the better option, if they said to me in 1787, pick one, I would have picked republicanism. It wouldn't have even been close. I would likely still pick it now.
We talk about checks and balances amongst the 3 branches of government, but there was another important check and balance, and that was the states checking the federal power.
Yeah.
And that got gutted when we changed to direct election of senators.
The 9th and 10th Amendments have become utterly pointless over time. I think they should have very real teeth. They do not. People have decided that they would prefer a government that, quote, does something, unquote. Just do something. people at the time of the ratification of the Constitution would say, don't do anything, just stand there. Do it if it's in your wheelhouse, right? If it's in the Article 1, Section 8 powers, by all means, have at it. But almost everything we do now is nowhere near the Article 1, Section 8 list. And you should go look up that list and read it for yourselves. Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. It's a list of all the things government is allowed to do. And then ask yourself, what did the government weigh in on today that I'm doing that's not on that list? You'll be there counting for a very, very long time.
Well, that's a good place to stop, James.
Yeah, I think I'm going to keep venting my spleen over on the Words and Numbers Backstage Patreon account in just a few minutes. So come on over. You can join us over there anytime you like. But apart from that, I give you the usual closing. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week when we talk about something that pisses me off almost exactly as much as this one did.
Which could be just about anything.
Yeah, that's right. We could talk about bowling, and I think I'd lose my mind about that. Until then, follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes.
Send email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
You know, you think if you say that faster, I won't notice? Ass.
Send email.
Oh, don't you dare.
Words. And numbers?
I'm going to punch you one of these
Podcast.
days. Yeah, that's right.
Go ahead, James.
Oh, now I can talk.
At Gmail.
Is that right?
No, I won't say anything else. .com.
There we go. We'd love to see you on the Words and Numbers Facebook group, Backstage, where the conversation continues. And if not, we'll see you here next week. And for crying out loud, be nice to each other. I mean, I know it's hard because right this second, I would punch Anthony in the mouth if he were here. And I would punch him so hard.
That's wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
But shut the swear to God.
You going to see me next week?
Maybe, maybe not. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, have a great week.